Invasion of Poland began on September 1st, 1939, almost 7 years after Hitler became chancellor. Over the next 6 years, the Nazis attacked, occupied and brutalized a large part of northern Africa and Europe. Everyone who lived in Germany during the time of military-industrial fascism had to deal with big changes in their daily lives, though these changes were often unique to each situation. For example, life in France while it was occupied was very different from life in Poland while it was occupied by Germany, which was different from life in Norway or the Balkans. But some things stayed the same. There wasn't enough food, German forces raped women, Jews were persecuted, Jews who weren't killed on the way to concentration camps were shipped there, and there were random acts of violence. But things weren't so bad in every place or country where the Nazis were strong. As a cultural and social hub, Paris was important to the German High Command, and they wanted to use it as a huge farm of sorts. They even supported the arts, in a limited way, as a way to show that society could thrive under Nazism. While Germany occupied France, Marcel Kahn and Robert Bresson made some of the country's most famous movies. However, one of Kahn's movies, Children of Paradise, was an act of resistance against the German government. However, the French were given some freedoms, while many Poles were treated like slaves. During World War II, the countries that Germany conquered were very strong and tough, even though they went through a lot of hard times. The Nazis loved Paris and promised it would be a cultural hub in their new world order. In 1941, a journalist for The Observer wrote, "The suggestion is implied that Paris, with its historical, cultural and entertainment value, is to become the chief center of recreation and relaxation for the German overlords of the future." The German plan was to congratulate the people of Paris and get them to work together. The Nazis liked Paris's film industry, singers, writers and actors, as well as its culture landmarks like bread, coffee shops and movie theaters, and historical sites. This was done to make the French like the Nazis and to start a propaganda effort about how art and society did better when the Nazis were in charge. The piece from The Observer concludes, "The surprising feature of this German campaign is the persistent emphasis placed upon the future role of German France as the holiday resort for the Nazi Herrenvolk, and the new attempt to win Paris by flattery instead of by repression." North African Jews were humiliated and interned in forced labor camps, and Tunisia was a training ground for the SS. The Nazis invaded several North African countries, such as Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Algeria, but they only took full control of Tunisia. Not many Jews were killed in Africa, but more than 10,000 were put in work camps and kept from having their basic rights and freedoms. As the Jewish virtual library states, particularly hard hit was Tunisia, the only Arab country to come under direct German occupation. In just 6 months, from November 1942 to May 1943, the Germans and their local collaborators implemented a forced labor regime, confiscations of property, hostage-taking, mass extortion, deportations and executions. They required thousands of Jews in the countryside to wear the Star of David, and they created special Judenrat-like committees of Jewish leaders to implement Nazi policies under threat of imprisonment or death. Tunisia was also the training ground for some of the most notorious Nazi killers, like SS Colonel Walter Rauff, who had earlier invented the mobile death gas van. Jews have lived in North Africa for more than 2,000 years, and historians worry that if the war hadn't finished when it did, they would all have died the same terrible death as the Jews in Europe. The Nazi propaganda machine tightly controlled all media and the flow of public information. In the parts of France that were captured, the media were tightly controlled. A new newspaper called Pariser Zeitung, Paris newspaper, came out in German, with only a small section of French-language news. This meant that most French people had no way of knowing what was really going on in the world. France, under Nazi rule, became a fascist media state with strict controls. Part of the point of the Parisian newspaper was to mentally split France that was occupied by Germany from Vichy France, which was the southern part of France that agreed to be self-governed by Germany. As a contemporary report states, this paper, the only source of information for the French people and the German army of occupation in northern France, has its own correspondent in Vichy. It does not circulate in unoccupied France, who summarizes the Vichy press as though it were the press of a foreign country. German troops and French people were constantly told positive stories about the friendship between France and Germany. These stories showed how the two countries could help each other. The Pariser Zeitung had a lot of nice things to say about the French and a picture every day that was mean to the British. Nazi-sponsored pogroms, such as those in Lviv, saw citizens murdering one another in the streets. Mass murder was common in parts of Eastern Europe that were ruled by the Nazis. In a series of pogroms, planned killings of a group of people that happened in the Baltic states, Poland, and the Soviet Union, German soldiers killed thousands of Jews in the middle of city streets. The Lviv pogroms, which happened in what is now Lviv, Ukraine, and what was then Lwów, Poland, are a good example. At least 4,000 Jews were killed by the Nazis and Ukrainian nationalists who worked with them over 3 and 4 days in June and July 1941. People were attacked by other people, like the woman in the picture, or arrested and taken from their homes. A lot of different reasons were given by the Nazis for why these pogroms happened, such as real or supposed plans to kill Jews, Jewish membership in communist groups, and so on. The annexation of Austria emboldened citizens to carry out brazen acts of anti-Semitic violence. On March 12, 1938, Germany took over Austria through an act called Anschluss. Hitler forced Austrian Chancellor Kurt von Schuschnigg to put Nazis in his cabinet and give up control of his country in the days before it was annexed. Old films show Austrians greeting Hitler's motorcade with smiles and salutes. This shows that many Austrians gathered in the street to cheer as the Nazi troops took over their country. Soon after, anti-Semitic violence broke out in Vienna. People attacked Jews and damaged their businesses, with Kristallnacht ironically named Crystal Night because broken glass was lying all over the streets. This reached its peak in Austria and Germany, which was then called the Greater German Reich. On November 9, 1938, and in some places for several days afterward, Nazis and regular people worked together to attack Jews and their businesses. This was supposedly in response to the killing of a minister by a Polish Jew on November 7th. They sent police to arrest the people they found, and fire departments were ready in case fires started in Jewish businesses threatened Aryan shops nearby. Rioters damaged or destroyed at least 7,500 Jewish businesses. They also attacked schools, synagogues, cemeteries, and houses. About 100 Jews were killed, and about 30,000 Jewish men were arrested. Famine was so pervasive. 30,000 people starved to death in Greece over a single winter. From the start of their plans to take over the whole world, the Nazi high command was worried about food. The people and the soldiers need food too, unless you want a revolt. The BBC says that Germany started rationing food on August 27, 1939, a few days before they invaded Poland. The Nazis set up a system called food entitlements. It was made up of different groups, such as normal customers, heavy workers, very heavy workers, children, and pregnant women. Based on what the party thought was needed, food was given to each class. Aryans got more food than Jews. Territories that were occupied had terrible famines, in part because the Nazis stole food from other countries to eat. Germany also stopped importing food from countries that helped the Allies or fought against Nazi rule in other ways. In Greece, during the winter of 1941 to 1942, more than 30,000 people died of hunger. Every day in December 1941, 300 people died in Athens. It was a strike in the Netherlands so that people could help the Allies. Germany stopped the country from getting food. When the country was freed in May 1945, 20,000 people had already died of hunger. Food rationing was very strict in Norway. People who lived in big towns like Oslo were hit the hardest. There were a lot of Norwegians who tore up flower gardens to grow potatoes, carrots, and turnips. Official rations were so sparse. Poland developed a black market for food. Historian Kazimierz Wika wrote that during World War II, the people of Poland faced a simple dilemma: either accept what one is now allowed to eat and die from hunger, or figure out a way to survive. Polish citizens were given so few and poor official rations that they had to come up with creative ways to get by. They broke the law by stealing from companies and making and selling food. In the end, there was an advanced black market in Poland for selling food without a license. The Germans could kill or arrest people who bought or sold goods and send them to concentration camps if they were found. German soldiers raped women across Europe with impunity. A lot of German men left home for the first time when they went to war. A website called Spiegel Online says that during World War II, less than 4% of Germans had IDs. As soldiers were pumped up with adrenaline and scared by the horrors of war, they were told to be monsters and kept away from the moralizing feelings of family and home. This means that what they did was very unlike them, so most of the men say. Many reports come from all over Europe of German forces sexually assaulting women. The stories below come straight from troops. In a small town in Russia, they were building roads, drop-dead gorgeous girls. So we drove by, pulled them into the truck, screwed them, and then threw them out again. Boy, they sure cursed at us. Also in Russia. Oh, we caught this female spy who had been running around in the neighborhood. First we hit her in the tits with a stick, and then we beat her rear end with a bare bayonet. Then we f***ed her, and then we threw her outside and shot at her. When she was lying there on her back, we threw grenades at her. Every time one of them landed near her body, she screamed. Many Polish citizens served as Germany's cheap expendable workforce. There were more than 2.8 million Polish people who were made to work for the Nazis during World War II. 100,000 were sent to work in Germany, but most worked from home in Poland. People who had to work in towns had to deal with harsh conditions and strict rules, like always having a P on their clothes. Workers lived close to the workshops where they did their jobs, and many of them made weapons. Bombing raids by the Allies hit companies that made weapons, and many forced Polish workers died when the factories were hit. Some forced laborers who worked on farms did a little better, but it depended on the conditions. Many small countries, like Lithuania, experienced decades of trauma and horror. Before World War II, Lithuania was ruled by the Soviet Union, which was cruel and murderous. People in Lithuania saw their chance to fight back and claim their independence when Hitler launched war on the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, they weren't able to stay out of the war. Germany quickly took over the small country, and while they let Lithuania keep its elected officials, they took away most of the power from the new government. In this way, Lithuania went straight from one slaughter to the next. While the Soviets were trying to kill all Lithuanians, Hitler was going after the country's large Jewish population. Politico says that 80% of Lithuania's Jews were killed in the first 6 months that the Nazis were in charge. By the end of the war, 90% of Lithuanian Jews were dead. Most of them had died in pogroms, which were events where Nazis told people to kill Jewish people. A New York Times article on a genocide museum in Vilnius, Lithuania, reads, "In the Ponary neighborhood, on the outskirts of town, there is a memorial, which eventually included the 70,000 Jews who were stripped naked and shot to death in the forest there. After World War II, the country was taken over by the Soviet Union, and the killing of Lithuanians kept going. The country didn't get its freedom back until March 11, 1990. Jews were isolated from fellow citizens by being forced into cramped ghettos as precursor to being shipped to concentration camps. The Nazis built ghettos to separate and control the Jewish people who lived in conquered countries and as a way to gather people to send to concentration camps. These were dirty, dangerous and oppressive areas that were very small and crowded. People who moved into ghettos were only allowed to bring a few personal things with them. This cut them off from family, historical and cultural items. Because Jews were kept separate from everyone else, they couldn't mix with them. This kept everyone else pure in the eyes of the Nazis. It was also the first step in a plan to get rid of or control the Jewish impact on society and culture. Jewish people who lived in ghettos were often forced to wear identifying marks, which let people outside the ghetto know they were Jewish. Ghettos sprung up all over Europe, with the most famous ones being in Poland, Belarus and Hungary. This made life very hard for Jewish Holocaust survivors. Citizen resistance movements throughout occupied territories saved lives, disrupted Nazi plans, and helped Allied troops. A lot of countries that the Nazis took over had strong resistance groups. These included France, Belgium, Greece, Denmark, Norway, and Poland. These groups, which were also known as the Underground, gave the Allies important information, saved Jewish lives, and made important decisions during the war. Some groups didn't even have weapons. They fought back against Germany by doing things like doing bad work on purpose in Nazi factories or supply lines. It was the French resistance's part in the street fighting that helped free Paris, and they gave the Allies important information as they planned the invasion of Normandy on D-Day. Due to how risky their work was, they attacked Nazis and their factories, among other things. People who joined the French resistance only had about 3 months to live. During the war, the Jewish-French resistance helped save the lives of thousands of Jews. The Danish resistance, with help from people in the government, the king wore a yellow Star of David to show support for Jews, helped almost all of the Jews in the country escape to Sweden before the Nazis could carry out the final solution in Denmark. There were only 492 Danish Jews who ended up in prison camps. 150 of them died. As the Holocaust reached remote areas, such as Belarus, entire villages were burned and murdered Jews were dumped in pits. In Belarus and other former Soviet states that fell under Nazi occupation, the Holocaust took place in a very different form than concentration camps. As historian Anita Wolke explains it, World War II began in the Belarusian Socialist Soviet Republic with the invasion of German troops in June 1941. By fall 1941, most Jews were confined to a ghetto, the largest one in Minsk, where about 70,000 Jews were interned. Often, these ghettos existed only for a short period of weeks or days, and they primarily served to gather Jews in preparation of genocide. Beginning in August 1941, German authorities, supported by auxiliary troops and local police that included Ukrainians, Lithuanians or Belarusians, began with the systematic extermination of Soviet Jews, rounding them up and shooting them at pits or trenches just outside their hometown. By early spring 1942, the majority of the Jews of Belarusia had been killed. As they marched through Russia to their death, the Nazis also burned down whole towns and killed everyone who lived there. After an attack outside of Katyn killed a German officer, a group of Nazi soldiers, including Ukrainian nationalists and Red Army deserters, surrounded the village, pushed all but 3 of the people living there into a shed, and burned them alive. The 3 people who made it out alive were all children who got away from the soldiers. During the Nazi rule, about 2,230,000 Belarusians died, which is about 25% of the population of the area. A modicum of civility remained in the Channel Islands, where residents differentiated between Germans and Nazis. The English Channel Islands are a group of islands between the south coast of the UK and Normandy in France. During World War II, these islands were the closest the Nazis came to taking over England. Their rule is kind of lost in the chaos of the war. Rachel Dinning, a historian, says that Hitler treated the Channel Islands with a soft hand. He wanted to set a good example of how to occupy a place, so that the British would be impressed and feel at ease while Germany bombed London to try to break the British resolve. Despite the relatively soft occupation, Dinning says, "For 5 years the residents lived an existence that wasn't completely free. They couldn't speak freely, they were living under curfew, and they were often struggling for food." Before the war, the island had been massively reliant on importing and exporting with the mainland. They managed to do a certain amount of trading with France. The Germans actually allowed that. But after D-Day, the Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944, they were cut off and began to starve. Towards the end of the war, the question wasn't whether the Allies would win, but whether they would die of starvation before the island could be liberated. Dinning continues, "I interviewed hundreds of residents for my latest book, Hitler's British Isles, and something that came up repeatedly was this idea that there were Nazis and there were Germans. Many local people saw the Germans as normal men who had found themselves in uniform. While there were a few real Nazis, individuals committed to National Socialism and Hitler, the majority of Germans on the island were just ordinary soldiers who wanted to go back to their homes and families. Some of them were actively looking for opportunities to form friendly relationships with the locals and to prove that they weren't the kind of monsters that they had been painted as by Allied propaganda. I think it helped that the people in charge of the occupation were these German aristocrats who, if anything, were quite suspicious of Hitler and his fascist ideology." We hope you liked this video. Watch another video here.